Hello. So I'm going to talk a bit about some sort of work in information theory that I've been doing and sort of loosely what it connects to in consciousness science. So this work was done originally for information theory. It started out as a kind of project for thinking about how information is actually structured between different systems, how they actually share information, and it really started as a kind of purely mathematical thing. And then I thought maybe it has some interesting consequences for what we might want to say about how information gets attached to different things and is about different things. So the framework called logarithmic decomposition. It's a way of making a thing called a signed measure space. So we'll see a little bit that this is the notion of having a space of qualities, so properties about things, and you can take pieces of that space and then you can measure them and get an amount of information that's attached to it. So you get a number and a quality. So that's why this seems to be a good approach. So why do we want to decompose information? What does that really mean? Well, lots of different theories of consciousness. We're thinking maybe that information theory might be a convenient and useful language for formalizing things, talking about how the brain gets information about different things. And we're thinking a lot lately as well about the kind of the structure of the phenomenal experience, what we're actually feeling, how is that structured, how does that relate to the structure of the brain. So making sure that we actually understand the structure of information itself, or some variation of information, is going to be really, really important for understanding how that relates to the structure of the phenomenal experience. So it's sort of this bridging language that we want to be able to see the structure of information so we can see it here in the brain and relate it back to what we're actually experiencing. And one way of thinking about structure is by breaking it down. So in the same way that we might want to study molecules by breaking it down into atoms and then putting them back together again in different shapes, we hopefully get a new perspective on how different systems can have different constituent pieces of information. So as I say, our approach is going to be using this thing called a signed measure space, this thing, and this logarithmic decomposition essentially provides this signed measure space. So a signed measure, so entropy in the Shannon sense, which is more or less what we're going to be dealing with for the rest of this. The signed measure perspective is not completely new. So Jung has essentially come in, I think, in 1991 and has fleshed out, building on the work of, I think, an earlier researcher called Hu or something. And he's fleshed out this idea of entropy as acting like a signed measure. So it's positive and it's negative. That's what the sign means. And the way this works is we take a bunch of variables. So this could be anything. So here we have some abstract variables x, y, and z, which are partitioning an outcome space. So they see different events, for instance. But it could also be information that's encoded by different brain regions. It could be things like this. And then we more or less allow them to have these kind of abstract sets of information, which represent all this sort of information they encode. And then we can talk about how they relate to one another. So for instance, here, x and y, this bit in the middle of their sort of information diagram, the entropy associated there is very, very low. The mutual information is almost zero. So knowing about x tells you very, very little about y. And you can do the same thing with more variables, but you suddenly get this annoying sort of problem that you get negative numbers. And it's not always immediately clear how you should interpret these negative numbers, but one way you can think of them is as kind of an informational synergy. And that's kind of something we're going to come back to. So we want to deal with this negativity problem. Because what does a negative number mean? Information that's shared between three systems. What does that mean if that's negative? So there's an approach called partial information decomposition that we're going to talk about, which is allowing us to characterize this properly and also see what information is hopefully actually shared between three or more systems, three or more brain regions, all sorts of different paradigms that you could want to talk about. These diagrams are actually called eye diagrams. I think Jung named them eye diagrams. And our goal is to make these Venn diagrams of something. Right? At the moment, there's a Venn diagram of a Venn diagram. We want to put little actual pieces of information inside of these diagrams to represent what is actually shared between these different spaces of information. So this co-information that we have from Jung's diagrams, it's not really enough. It sometimes conflates things which are very, very different. So for instance, we have these two systems. These are called the dyadic and the triadic systems. They're due to, I think, James and Crutchfield, I think, 2016. These are two very differently behaved systems. We have these sort of coupled bits. Don't worry too much about all of this, but essentially they're very structurally different. This one has an XOR in the middle. So structurally very, very different way of breaking up the information. But if you look at these eye diagrams, they look exactly the same. So you would never have any idea that they were actually structured in a different way. So you want to be able to untangle these two kinds of systems. So in particular, I think James and Crutchfield say in their paper, no standard Shannon-like information measure and exceedingly few non-standard methods can distinguish the two. So that should be something that we want to aim to do, that we have done. So yes, so when we're actually going to construct this measure, I'm going to go a bit through the maths, don't worry too much about it. But just so we can have a think about how we go about it in case anyone's interested in the maths bit. This is the sort of the path there. So we're going to have a little think about the sort of qualitative structure of information. We're going to have a kind of intermediate measure of information called the entropy loss. Not a world-changing idea, but then we do this neat little Möbius inversion, and then we build this final measure, this interior entropy loss, which albeit needs a new name because that's quite, quite a mouthful. Okay, so that's how we're going to do this. So to sort of motivate it a little bit more in the sort of awareness of information sense, here we have a bag of shapes, a green circle, a green square and a red circle. And we're going to imagine that we have two observers. So we have myself and a dog, or anyone in the audience who might be red-green colorblind who can play along. The point is that if I take off my glasses, I lose all of the information about the shape, right? But I still have access to the color. These are all just blobs now. This dog has something else. The dog can now see the shape, but he can't make out the difference of the colors, or she. And this is a kind of interesting situation where if I give the dog, for instance, this shape 1 and 2, these two green things, it can tell them apart, but I can't. Same thing with 1, 3. I can tell those apart, but the dog can't. But this relationship that 2 and 3 are not the same, me and this dog, we both have access to that. We both have this shared awareness of this relationship between these two objects, albeit for different reasons, but it's an awareness of a relationship. So both of us as observers have information missing, but we have something in common as well. So that's a sort of an intro to how we're starting to think about structuring this. So when we're actually looking at the space of how we break this down, this logarithmic decomposition is breaking stuff down into atoms, so little pieces. We said we're breaking it down so we can put it back together again. And all of these pieces sort of correspond to sort of the faces and the edges on high-dimensional triangles. Sounds a bit overcomplicated, but actually they have a very nice sort of operational interpretation. So the 1, 2 atom corresponds to the ability to discern between object 1 and object 2, 1, 3 discerning between object 1 and object 3, and the 1, 2, 3 the ability to discern anything between those three. So you can see that the dog has access to the 1, 2 atom, I have the 1, 3, and we now share the 2, 3 and the 1, 2, 3 atom. So actually now we've got some things inside of our Venn diagram. We actually have pieces of information that the dog and I are actually sharing. So if you think about this qualitatively, what we're really doing is thinking about how different outcomes encode a qualitative information. And the way we could think about this, so I flip 2 coins, right? I'm going to get any one of these 4 things could happen. I could get heads, 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 tails, 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 heads. And this notion of separating the first coin, so this division, this separation between all the worlds in which I had heads and all the worlds in which I had tails, that is qualitatively different from the horizontal one, this other one where we're thinking about the second coin. So we think about these separations as the actual quality, as the space, and then we can measure them to get an amount of entropy back. And this is fine, this has actually been seen before, way back in I think the 60s, but only for orthogonal boundaries, so independent variables, and we have to do a bit more construction to make sure that we can go beyond this. Okay, cool. So actually building the measure, the way we do this, not too complicated, we think about how much information a variable has, and then we think about how much information it lost if we suddenly stopped being able to see the difference between things. So if 1, 2, and 3 are things I can all discern between, different shapes maybe, and then suddenly I lose the ability to tell them apart, how much entropy has that system lost? That's what we're labeling this L, this entropy loss measure, and we're going to use it to build our actual measure. Okay. So then there comes a little bit of a mathematical trick. To actually assigning entropy towards these different atoms, we do a Möbius inversion, and we compute this thing called the interior entropy loss, and this will assign an amount of information to each of these individual atoms. Okay, so this one in the middle is going to depend on how we're building the ones on the outside. Now this should be justified a bit, because if you know the Möbius inversion, this is just a kind of mathematical trick. It will always work. You know, you will always get a kind of additive system out. But why can you do it in this case? Why should it be justified? Well, it has some really nice properties. You know, and if it has nice properties, then maybe we're touching something a bit more fundamental, is that we can define this measure well when we have a zero probability, so not everything just falls apart. We have this really nice ordering relation on the contribution to the entropy. So if you're thinking about edges on triangles, the entropy associated to the face has to be smaller than the entropy of all of the edges. And so on, going up into these higher order interactions, they have to get essentially a smaller and smaller contribution to the entropy. Is this still working? Yes, okay. And the sign, as actually possibly the most convincing reason why you should be able to allow yourself to do this Möbius inversion, is because the sign of these atoms is fixed. So you go from this situation way back here, where we sometimes have a negative number in the middle, or sometimes a positive one, and now suddenly we have atoms which we now completely understand when they're positive and when they're negative. So we actually have a much better understanding of what that means. So there's a geometric intuition for this. Here's, for instance, two frames. We have X and Y. These represent essentially the information encoded by X and information encoded by Y. And then if you intersect them, then la-di-da, you actually get a nice set theoretic intuition for what the information is that's actually shared between them. So this would be the mutual information between X and Y. Okay? And one thing that we could do with this logarithmic decomposition is something called partial information decomposition, which you might have heard of before. And this is the idea of doing something not quite so fine, but breaking down information into sort of larger characteristic parts about how they're actually being processed. So the classic example of this is the human visual system. So if I take this little controller thing, I put it right in front of both of my eyes, two variables, two sources of information, and another thing that I'm trying to get information about. I'm going to get two copies of it, two copies of some information. That's the redundant information. If I put it all the way over here on the far left of my vision, this is now unique to my left eye. If I put it over here, it's now unique to my right eye, that information. But the really interesting thing is the depth, right? I can't see how far away this object is unless I use both sources to compute it, right? So that information is only accessible in this sort of synergistic fashion by having access to both sources. So these are sort of broad, like large-scale chunks of ways of thinking about information processing, essentially. And we can do this partial information decomposition in a sort of meaningful way with the logarithmic decomposition. So here's an example with an OR gate to really give you an actual idea. So we have a little OR gate down here. And then we're going to label each of the outcomes. And then when you actually draw this entire diagram, this is how the information is distributed between all of these three variables. All these little atoms are distributed like this. They all have an entropy, positive or negative. Add them all up, you get the right numbers out, right? And now if you think about this whole thing in a really abstract way, you start thinking about it as rings, or maybe as a sort of a lattice with upper sets, then you can think about ideals in that ring or something like that. And it seems to make a really nice way of thinking about information that's actually shared between these three systems. So that would be the shared information. This would be the unique information. You can ask me why that's true later. This bit here will be, the negative of this will be the synergistic information. And the actual numbers you get out the other side are these numbers here. So you have this much information which is essentially shared between the three variables. So it has this really nice algebraic way of breaking information down that seems to reflect something possibly more fundamental about the structure. So going back to me and the dog, this is just going to be actually the mutual information in this system, but the dog and I in this case are going to have 0.25 bits of information in common about this system. It's just the mutual information, but we could, if we wanted, extend this to all sorts of different properties. I don't know how many sides these different things have or something. Actually this measure is strong enough now to discern between these dyadic and triadic systems, and it actually might be one very good way of thinking about this Shannon-like measure that James and Crutchfield were talking about, which didn't exist back in the past. So it plays very well with the Shannon information. It plays very well with partial information decomposition. Who knows if it's right, but I guess we'll see. So a little brief word on sort of implementations in the brain. You can actually do this experimentally. So if I take a bunch of regions in the brain, I can break up the brain into sort of 100 parcels or 200 or so. I can look at the information between those two different regions maybe, and I can see how that's shared, how that's structured, how it informs the rest of the activity in the brain. And you can use this this LDP idea is logarithmic decomposition, partial information decomposition. And you can use this if you wanted to. Would be one way of looking at sort of information dynamics in the brain. So this is a paper using a slightly different version of a PID, but you can actually see that the sort of higher thought regions have these more synergistic interactions, and motor and sort of sensory regions tend to have these slightly more redundant interactions. So an actual experimental way that you can use this information. Okay, so this is actually really useful as a kind of experimental paradigm, and it's going to be super, super useful in general, I think, because it's suddenly giving us this real important power of talking about the information that is truly shared, possibly truly shared, between several things. So if we're doing, for instance, a kind of some kind of paradigm where we have a stimulus and we're observing someone's behavior, but we're also looking at their brain activity, the last thing we want is a negative number to pop up in the middle of this and we don't know what it means. If we can actually say how much information was shared between those three things, that's going to give us like some really interesting measures that we can now apply to actual computational neuroscience and actually see what we get out the other side. So lastly here we have, for instance, this is a paper that's been done on macaques. This was about synergistic versus redundant processing using only the co-information. They didn't do a PID, so they didn't break it down in the same way. And you see that because they made that distinction, they didn't do this. They can only have one or the other at a time, but the reality is you could have both. And this is how we build on these kinds of paradigms. We can actually have situations where we'd have both redundant and synergistic processing at the same time. So we could capture a much more intricate picture of information processing in the brain. So a philosophical note, and then I'll finish. I've been told to make this a bit more open for discussion and how we can think about this. What if the universe is just a big old bucket of relations? What if it's all made out of relationships and information about separating things and making distinctions between things? And maybe an experience is just suddenly an awareness of these different relationships. And you could think of this maybe as a relation in the brain, possibly an informational relation in the brain, structured in a clever way, mirroring relations in the world. You know, if you do this, then maybe you have a way of thinking about how the brain might capture in an informational sense these relations in the world and how those might be structured. And this logarithmic decomposition and this PID more generally is one of these great directions, I think, for exploring the structure of these kinds of relational mirroring or whatever you want to call it. But I think it's going to be a really, really helpful tool. So just to thank my supervisors, Dan Bohr and Pedro Mediano, my lab, Cambridge Consciousness and Cognition, and the Neural Information Dynamics lab at Imperial. That's everything. Thank you very much.